everyone, and welcome to the second event in our fall webinar series. I'd like to thank you for joining us from your respective locations across the country. Be sure to stay up to snuff with us on news literacy topics on social media. We're on all those platforms. If you haven't had a chance yet, please do follow us. I would like to also advance this slide. Here we go. We're glad you're here for exploring the misinformation landscape. Again, a huge thanks to Smart News and their support for making this webinar series possible. You are registered for the entire series, which is every Tuesday in October at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. So the next 2 Tuesdays, we'll have these following topics. And yes, we are going to share the recordings, a PDF of the slide deck, a printout of the Q&As. I beg your forgiveness, we are running a little bit late with getting out the information from last week's, but it will be on its way to you soon. I appreciate that, Tracy. Thank you. Just a little reminder about the chat and Q&A. If you take a peek at those on your screen, for the chat, you have that toggle option of sending something just to the panelists or to everyone. And we're going to be keeping an eye out on the Q&As, especially to pull a few to be answered as we go through this session. We have a 30-minute at the very end where we're going to answer anything else we hadn't gotten to. And we'll make those available to you afterwards as well. We have the combined wisdom and research of our ed team with us today. So Peter, Hannah, Susanna, and Jordan, all from News Literacy Project, we're all going to be answering the questions you post. So keep them coming. And if you are just logging on now, we are going to record the video. And we appreciate you being here today. So let's go ahead and get started. John, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And again, welcome everyone to the second in our webinar series. If you missed last week's Introduction to News Literacy Education, we do have the video posted to our YouTube channel, and we will be sharing that with you very, very soon. So if you're not familiar, my name is John Silva. I'm part of the education team at the News Literacy Project. My primary roles involve facilitating and developing professional development as well as education resources for teachers to teach various concepts in news literacy. I do spend a good deal of my time researching and trying to understand better trends in misinformation and particularly conspiracy theories. I'm a former classroom teacher. I spent 13 years in Chicago public schools teaching social studies. On the lower left of your screen, that is my email address. If you'd like to follow up with me and ask some questions directly, please feel free. And if you're active on Twitter, I do share a lot of ideas and resources and topics and things. So you can go ahead and give me a follow there. And you heard her, but I will have her introduce herself a little more formally, my colleague, Miriam Romes.
Thanks, John. So I work with John very closely on professional development events and also running the Newslit Camp events for NLP. And literally, when I'm not busy bugging the heck out of John, I am a documentary photographer. I am a former photo editor. I used to work with Nueva Luz Photographic Journal and have just a couple of years in adult education. Our PD email is underneath my name. So if you have questions, you know, about any of these, I'll be happy to answer them. So feel free to email me. And yeah.
Great.
See you all soon.
Thank you. So one of the first things I feel is really important to confront before we really start talking about misinformation is the term fake news. We all know it. Likely many of us have used it, usually probably ironically for many of us. But the thing is that fake news as a term has become really problematic in a lot of different ways. It used to be a specific type of misinformation. It used to be fake news stories that were designed to look as if they were from real news organizations. They were generally made as a form of clickbait for advertising revenue. But in the last several years, the term fake news has become both politicized and weaponized. And it is used as a dismissive, derisive term that usually means like, I don't like that, I don't agree with that, that makes me look bad. And so we have to recognize that misinformation is a very complex field. And we're going to try to break that down a little bit tonight because there's a lot of different types. It takes a lot of different forms. But what it's designed to do, all the types of misinformation, it's really designed to overwhelm us, to manipulate us, to get us to not trust reliable information, and worse. And so we're going to talk about how to break it down and some important ways that we can teach this to students. So some examples, I always like to show some examples, particularly from the SIFT. We've used this before, but just to sort of make sure we have a good frame of reference, we see viral videos such as this one. This is an old video of President Trump that was taken out of context and made to look like he was disoriented and lost track of what he was doing. The interesting thing is that the person who posted this originally, their account has actually been deleted, but variations of this tweet and this video are still being shared on social media as if it were true. Also recently, following the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, an image showing NBA players wearing this t-shirt with the lace collar went viral. They weren't wearing that shirt. It was originally a Black Lives Matter shirt. You can see this is the original image here. Also things like political propaganda. This is a fake fundraising email made to look like it came from the Trump-Pence campaign, trying to capitalize and raise money after the president announced that he and the First Lady had tested positive for COVID-19. But we also see things like hoaxes. People share things that are not true, false rumors and hoaxes, and they sort of prey upon some of the things that we are fearful about, I have anxieties about, and we'll talk a little bit more about these as we go through. So just a question for you to think about. Think back through in your own social media use, whether or not you have actually shared something on social media that you later discovered was false. Or perhaps maybe you almost did. We've all certainly seen false information come across our feeds, but think about a time that you may have shared something that you later discovered was false and why that happened. And just kind of have that memory in the back of your brain as we go through this, because it's hopefully that'll connect to some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So we have to get rid of the term fake news entirely. We have to stop using it. It's a really problematic term, but obviously if we're going to get rid of the term, we have to replace it with something more relevant. So we're going to talk tonight about a new vocabulary for understanding misinformation, because there are a lot of different variations. It takes many different forms. And so we need to talk about it in more accurate, objective terms. But one of the other things that we're going to talk about tonight is about how we can debunk misinformation and why this action is a very important part of 21st century civic engagement. So this is going to be the objectives that we're going to cover tonight. So there's four main things. We're going to talk about differentiating types of misinformation. We're going to talk about how they differ and ways that we can identify them. We'll talk a little bit about why people actually share misinformation or why they create it, and those can be very different. We'll touch again about the role of emotion. We talked about it a little bit last week, but we'll talk about how emotion plays in all this. And then I'll go through some strategies for how you can try to effectively debunk misinformation. So the first, we're going to talk about differentiation. You may have seen this. So this is from First Draft. Dr. Claire Wardle and her team have put together this chart for what they call 7 types of mis and disinformation. And it is a good starting point, and I'll share a link to First Draft towards the end in the resources. It's a good starting point, and it does sort of inform a lot of the different types. But one of the things that's difficult about this is that some of what is required for this is to try to identify intent. I'll talk a little bit about intent as we go through this, but as you can imagine, it is very difficult often to objectively identify intent behind a post. And so what we've done at the News Literacy Project, and in the way we teach it, is that we've actually simplified this to 5 key types of misinformation. And we do this, and we actually have a lesson specifically about this in the Checkology virtual classroom. Dr. Wardle is actually the subject matter expert that takes students through this lesson to talk about these 5 different types. So I'm going to show you some quick examples. You may have seen this image from back in April. This woman was at a reopen the economy protest, and she appears to be holding this sign. And you can see that if you look, the numbers don't add up correctly to 19. And the original image is in the upper right. So we call this manipulated content. So what that means is that it's a real image, but one aspect of it has been altered from the original, usually through Photoshop or for some other photo editing means. Sometimes this can also apply to videos. People can alter videos in some way. And it's important to recognize that it's very easy to manipulate certain types of images, especially things with signs and t-shirts. Those are so easy to Photoshop, and it's something to be wary of. So manipulated content is actually one of the most common types of misinformation out there. Another one is false context. We mentioned this one. False context is also a very common type of misinformation. And basically what we've done, what happens is that we've changed something about it, or we've selectively edited it, and we've changed the content to create new false context. So that video of President Trump was shortened to focus just on one aspect of it and left out important context to understand what was really happening. People who also shared it made it appear that the video had happened recently when the video is actually over 2 years old. The third kind is fabricated content, which is completely different. Well, it's very different from manipulated, but the idea behind fabricated content is that the whole thing is made up. We see this with a lot of hoaxes and rumors. So you may have seen this post claiming that President Trump had said hundreds of governors are calling him. He never said this. No one has been able to find any clear evidence to suggest that he actually said this. This is something that was completely made up. So when we have something that's completely made up and it's designed to deceive us into thinking it's real, that's what fabricated content is. Another is imposter content. So the comedian Chelsea Handler shared this to suggest that this was a tweet from President Trump in November of 2009. The thing is that this is a completely fake tweet. There are a lot of apps and websites out there that you can actually just put in some information, choose a handle, and create fake tweets, fake Instagram posts, fake Facebook posts. But the idea behind imposter content is that it's using a well-known name or even like a corporate logo and trying to make us believe that it's authentic content. And so you might see this with fake tweets about companies and businesses and whatnot. Also, sometimes we see this with fake quotes being attributed to someone who is famous. And then the last one is satire. We don't often think of satire specifically as being a type of misinformation, but it's important to include in this conversation. So this is the Babylon Bee. It's a very prolific producer of satire. They put out this original photo about the t-shirts. And so nailing down a clear definition of satire is sometimes difficult. English teachers, social studies teachers often have slightly different definitions, but this is how we try to define it. But we have to remember that in the end, satire is designed to make us laugh at something that is meant to be an exaggeration and in some ways has an air that it might be somewhat true. But the more important part of satire is that a lot of times when people put out misinformation and there's pushback, people will use claims of satire as a defense and say, hey, it's not my fault you thought it was real, it's just satire. So it's important for us to teach young people how to identify satire so that they can recognize what's legitimately satire and if somebody's falsely using it as a defense. So these are the 5 types that we have simplified to sort of create this vocabulary, this nomenclature of types of misinformation. And there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this with students. We do have the lesson on misinformation, but it's important because understanding the type is a really important way of understanding how and why it's created. So I'll pause here to see if there are any questions about the 5 types or some of the things that we've covered already so far. So if there's anything in the Q&A. Nope, we don't seem to have anything just yet. Cool. All right, we'll keep going then. All right, so why do we have this problem? So why are people out there creating these things and why are people sharing it? So one of the challenges of this, I mentioned it earlier, is this question of intent. We do want to try to see if we can determine the intent behind a piece of misinformation, because intent can help us partially determine type, partially determine motivations, but it's often very difficult. We can't always know why someone created something or why someone shared something, because the motivations and the intent is different for the people who create this misinformation and the people who share it. And even when you look at the people who are sharing things, their intent and their motivations can be different among them. And the intent is also partially how it influences our emotions and the responses that we have. But by trying to have these conversations and trying to discuss possible intent, it actually helps us understand misinformation at a deeper level. So there are 4 basic motivations that we can sort of categorize. People sometimes will create it as an attempt to make money. Some people are doing it just because they can and they're trying to cause problems. But the more problematic and in some cases more common types of misinformation are about political and social issues. We see a lot of it with people trying to use misinformation to discredit a political opponent or political party or to support theirs. And in the most extreme cases, we actually see misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are actually intending to try to undermine the trust in our democracy. So some examples of the people who are the propagators of this. So self-interest, this is one of the types. This is where people are trying to focus on their individual interest at the expense of others. The group interest is like we're trying to promote or further the interest of our group that they identify with over others. In some cases, people are sharing it for what is in a positive intent through altruism. Sometimes people are sharing things because they genuinely believe that something is true and it's important for them to share it. And then you have the trolls. You have the people who are on the extreme edges of this, and they are intentionally trying to cause problems. They're trying to provoke serious responses, or they're actively trying to malign someone. So some of the examples of this with self-interest, we see this with people who are trying to run scams, clickbait farms. Sometimes companies will put out false information to try to further their interests. With groups, we see this in hyper-partisan groups. Sometimes government elected officials, government agencies, and the like. Ordinary people tend to be the ones who share things altruistically more than others. And then you have the trolls, people who have extreme political views, and then also conspiracy theory followers tend to fall into the malicious category. So it's not always easy to categorize these things, but these categories are a good starting point. So I'll start to show you some examples. So self-interest with scams, phishing scams are often using some types of false information to try to gain access to your personal information, maybe your bank accounts. So this is one that just has popped up recently. People are getting these text messages that are popping across their screens that they have a package pending. And so this is where people are sharing false information because they're trying to get a hold of your personal information. Group interest, the fake Donald Trump tweet, right? They're trying to, this person, whoever created this, is trying to discredit President Trump and trying to bolster their political viewpoints about him. By sharing this, it's really all about partisan politics. This is an example of something that someone might share altruistically. So there was a false rumor going around that if you microwaved your mask for 2 to 3 minutes in a Ziploc bag, that it would sanitize your face mask. It's absolutely not true, but people shared it thinking that it was real, to the point where actually fire departments around the country had to put out notices to say, hey, don't do this. This is actually very dangerous, because people were microwaving their masks and they were starting fires. This is one of the consequences of misinformation, but you can sort of understand why someone would feel like that would be something worth sharing. And then the last is something that's malicious. Here's something that is patently false, specifically about Amy Coney Barrett, who's going through the Supreme Court nomination process right now. You know, people are sharing these extreme false rumors about her, trying to discredit her as an individual and her viewpoints. So these types and these motivations bring up some interesting discussion questions that you can share with your students to try to talk about these. So for example, with this fake quote, how can we objectively determine the intent? You know, when somebody created this rumor as opposed to somebody who shared it, is there a way that we can really objectively determine what their intentions were? You can imagine that somebody created this and sent it out into social media, and you know, they had an intent, but then the intent behind the people who shared it can be varied. And so we have to try to have a conversation like, is it something we can objectively determine? Who should be held accountable for things like this? So someone created this rumor, other people shared it, people actually set their microwaves in their kitchens on fire as a result. So there are some very real world consequences. Should there be accountability for that? And how should we hold them accountable? Do we hold them all equally accountable, right? So someone who shared this, even though they were doing it altruistically, you know, is this something that should have been verified before it was shared? And should there be some level of accountability? Another question of accountability is what happens when someone has taken something out of context. So for example, this is a digital artist who makes these images on their on their Instagram page. So this person made this with these flamingos in the canals of Venice. And people took this image out of its original context of the Instagram account and shared it in the context that because of the quarantines and the lockdowns, the flamingos had returned. So, you know, should there be some accountability when things like digital artwork that were created as artwork are used to create misinformation? And then consequences. So we know that there are some consequences for sharing misinformation, but what about some of the consequences for someone who is part of the misinformation through no fault of their own? So we have this woman who was at this protest, originally holding this sign that says, "Give me liberty or give me death." And someone photoshopped that sign to make it look like she was spreading a conspiracy theory about COVID-19 and the shutdown. And this image went massively viral. It's still out there on social media. You can still find it occasionally. But what about this person who now people believes that she believes this crazy conspiracy theory? So understanding what some of the consequences might be for people who are the subject of misinformation, whether intentionally or not, the real world consequences of sharing false information. So if you think about, like, also with consequences, what about, you know, the health misinformation that's out there about masks and COVID-19 vaccines and such. So having a conversation about consequences can really help students understand things, that it's more than just something that's false on their screen. So I'm gonna, I'll touch on emotions real quick, and then I'll pause again for questions. You know, emotions plays a very strong role through all of this. I mentioned this last week, but I'll sort of remind people that the most important thing that misinformation is trying to do in all of this is to manipulate us through having a strong emotional response. Because in that emotional response, the rational parts of our brain are basically being overridden, and we're reacting through our emotion. And what people who are creating this misinformation is hoping that we will do is that we will, in that emotional moment, that we will simply react and share and retweet and comment and help spread that misinformation, that in our emotions, we will help it go viral. And it's always important to remember that young people are especially vulnerable to this type of emotional manipulation because of the brain development. The rational parts of the brain that control executive functions aren't fully developed until the early to mid 20s. And so young people, adolescents especially, and younger, they're mainly using the emotion centers of their brains. And so they're very easily manipulated. But it's also important to remember that the same is true for older adults. If we're thinking about, our friends, our family, our loved ones, people who are over 65 are just as susceptible to being manipulated through their emotional response as young people are. And we have to always remember that any emotion can be used against us. Fear and sadness, anger, like these are pretty common. People who are sharing, scams and clickbait, right? We might be using our curiosity. It might be something that we're hopeful, right? So the fake, you have a package waiting, right? If you get a message that says you have a package waiting for you, like, you are gonna be curious, depending on what it is. You might be hopeful that it's something good, and in that emotion that you're having right there, they're hoping that you'll sort of click through and then you might be down a path of being phished. Okay, so let's pause here again to see if there are any questions.
Hey, John, we do have some great questions coming up. On the topic of emotions, Maria is asking, as a teacher, I have to admit that sometimes I teach to emotional responses as well. What advice do you have for teachers to encourage young people to be aware and care for issues in society, but not fall for the emotional traps of misinformation?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I really like that question, because I think it's important to remember that an emotional response is completely natural, right? And what's important for us to do is to take a second to try to really evaluate and think about why we're having an emotional response. If you think about social and political issues, right, there are things going on in our communities that are causing us to have emotional reactions. When we see police brutality happening, when we see abject poverty, when we see massive protests and the like, when we see the effects of climate change and the wildfires, like those will affect us on an emotional level. But what's important is for us to remember that, like, we can have an emotional response to something that we can identify rationally, right? I see police brutality, that makes me angry because that, I believe that's an injustice, and that's something that we need to correct, and that's something that we need to address. Whereas if somebody shares a fake image of something, we have to understand, are we being manipulated by something that's not true, or are we having an emotional response to something that we can rationally identify as being true? So it's important to understand, like, in that moment, you have to take a minute to think, okay, so I'm having this emotional reaction. Why am I having this emotional reaction? And then that's the next step where you can go to.
Great. We have one from Carrie about accountability. How could people help be accountable? Social media just takes down mis or disinformation, but is anyone ever punished?
The short answer is no, because it's very difficult to try to to define what's an appropriate punishment. Sharing false information and determining the intent behind it. There are libel and slander laws that could be applied in some cases. You can point to people who are sharing misinformation because it is a scam, or it's something that's fraudulent. That in those cases. But generally, sharing other types of misinformation and conspiracy theories, there really isn't. And platforms, the social media platforms, have been trying to take steps to address it by removing it. Facebook has recently announced that they're removing everyone that is promoting QAnon conspiracy theories. They've stopped allowing people to take out ads that share anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. Twitter is trying to take some steps. So really, the only repercussions in many cases is, deplatforming, taking people off the platforms. So how could we, I think there's a lot of ideas out there. They are difficult to try to nail down, but that could also be an interesting discussion question with your students.
All right, one more, or what do you think, John?
Yeah, let's one or two. Let's see one or two more. What's in there?
Okay, so we have a couple related to what to give students, right? To start that process of sifting through and getting to source things. Let's go with Cynthia's. I teach 7th graders and often struggle with sharing examples of misinformation among other topics with them because so many of the topics are unrelatable. It's like training them for the future, but it's hard to relate now. Very tricky. Any ideas for how to make this type of content relatable?
Yeah, Cynthia, you're right. With middle schoolers and younger, it is often very difficult to share real world examples of misinformation because the content can be very problematic, can be triggering in some cases. I would point you in the direction of our newsletter, The Sift, where we do try to share some examples. We do try to share things that are appropriate for other age groups. We have a link to a resource library on our website, which I'll share towards the end, where you can find some things that are appropriate for middle grades and younger. I would say that, the rabbit hole danger is very real. You don't want students to go out there on their own trying to look for it. So I think one of the things you might also do is to try to follow some of the people who do misinformation research. You could look at some of the fact-checking websites that do share some fact checks. Snopes has some good resources that way. But it is difficult to try to use authentic images for younger students.
All right, good. We can get to some of the other ones later in the next pause.
Actually, this one from Kate Herzog. Did somebody answer that one?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, so let's go into how we debunk misinformation. And one of the most important things I need to emphasize is that there are a lot of wrong ways to try to debunk misinformation. And there are some ways that can lead you to a successful outcome, but none of it is easy. So I'm going to go through some strategy and we're going to talk a little bit about it, how we can do this. So before we start, I just want to throw a poll question up. I want to get some information from you. So the question is so two things. So have you ever tried to debunk misinformation, something that was false that someone else posted on social media? Have you ever tried to do it? And then if you can, for a minute in the chat, describe whether or not you were successful. So if yes, you tried, and if you have a quick example that you can share with us in the chat, I'd love to sort of see a little bit about what how it might have gone for you. So Lisa says, I referred my uncle to the site on Snopes where his reposted info was debunked. Yeah, the dead celebrity hoaxes are very common. Frustration tone got in the way. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so you're not going to be successful in debunking if the person isn't listening. Yeah, Kitty, people do reject fact checking, and that is a challenge. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay. Yeah, so Karen says, very leery of trying to debunk strangers. Yeah, that can be difficult. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But it's interesting that, 20% of you haven't tried. Most of you say sometimes it depends. Yeah, it's very challenging. And I'm going to try to share some ideas and strategies to make that hopefully a little less challenging for you. And it's something you can also share with your students. Okay. So the keys to effectively debunking misinformation. First, we have to absolutely verify first that something is false. And then we have to deliberately and carefully select the evidence that we're going to use that proves that it's false. What we're trying to do is two things. We want to reduce how much people are arguing about the claim that's in line with the misinformation, right? There's a lot of people who are arguing back and forth. We want to try to reduce that. And in that, we want to introduce evidence in a way that gets the people to scrutinize it themselves and to see the evidence and then start talking about the evidence as opposed to the original misinformation. We want to provide detailed information in a way that lets people look at it themselves. Because one of the things that we also know, even if we don't reach the person who posted the misinformation, one of the things that's really important to remember is that by simply introducing the evidence and calling the misinformation into question, we will actually reduce the virality of that piece of misinformation. People who see that in the comments, when we call it into question, will be less likely to share it. So even if we're not successful with the person who posted the misinformation, we will see some success in the fact that it will be shared less than it otherwise would have. And in all of this, when we're doing this, we absolutely have to remember that we have to keep our expectations low. So obviously, one of the first things that we have to do is we have to fact check it, and we have to collect evidence. So just to go through a couple of the key skills again, just as a refresher, I'm going to use this. I'm going to use the sign, right? So we want to use our good old-fashioned eyeballs. We're going to look at it closely, and if you zoom in on the image, you can see that there's some distortion in her fingers. They're at an unnatural angle. There's some pixelation around the edge of the sign that doesn't match up with the rest of the sign, and so those are some indications. And that observation can be a piece of evidence that you might use when you're looking at this, right? So this is a first step. We want to think about all the things that we can call into question that will help people question the image. The second is the reverse image search, right? So by going to the tweet, we're going to right click on it and we're going to click on that search Google for image. We'll find the fact checks. So we see the Snopes fact check. With fact checking organizations, one of the most important things to remember is that we have to make sure that with the fact check that they're showing their work. And we might also want to have more than one fact check depending on what it is, because Snopes, for example, people will dismiss Snopes because they perceive it as being hyperpartisan or not accurate or not professional or whatever. So having more than one fact check will help. And so we get some fact checks. But one of the other things we have to be careful of when we're looking at the results is making sure that we're not using sources that are simply amplifying and spreading the original misinformation. The third is lateral reading. So we're going to enter some details from the original post. We're just going to put Barack Hussein Obama COVID-19 sign. Again, we're going to go through the list. So we have a fact check from Snopes. We have a fact check from AP News. And in that lateral reading, just a reminder what that is, we're using deliberate search strategies to try to get the best results, right? We're using key details, maybe putting things in quotation marks, maybe phrasing it as a question. We're going to use that good click restraint by not just clicking on the first thing. We're going to look at the results and choose them carefully, making sure that we've got relevant, reliable sources. We have to evaluate all the sources we find, and then we collect that evidence until we're confident that we have enough that we can share. And if you want to learn more about lateral reading and click restraint, these are terms that were developed by Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education, the Stanford History Education Group. They're doing a lot of great work out there. Okay, so once we have our evidence and we've got that ready, then we can go in and try to do some debunking. So again, here's the image we're going to use. The number one thing to remember is that we should not be confrontational. If we are confrontational, that's going to trigger the backfire effect, which basically means that if a person feels that a belief is being challenged, that they're being challenged, they're just going to reject whatever is challenging them. And they're going to hold on to that belief a little tighter. They're going to reject everything, and they're not going to listen, right? We don't want to make them feel like they're foolish. We don't want to mock them. We also don't want to lecture. We don't want to say, hey, you're wrong. You posted something that's wrong, and here's why you're wrong, right? You don't want to do that. We have to start from a position of empathy, because we have to be open to the idea that the person who shared that might believe that it's true. They might not realize that it's false. So we want to use some empathy, validate like what they shared and what they believe, and then try to pivot into the evidence. And we want to share that evidence in a way that allows them to look at it themselves. So we can do it in a couple different ways. But again, with keep our expectations low, we always have to be willing to just cut our losses and recognize that someone may not be willing to listen. And if we continue down that path, it might actually lead to a confrontation. And we just don't want to do that. That's not a good way for you to spend your time. Nobody really wants to be in that moment. So sometimes we just have to be willing to walk away, but also recognize that by sharing the evidence, we've already done something to try to reduce the virality of that misinformation. So a way you might do this, right, is so approaching with caution. So this is something you might say like, that's shocking. I'm skeptical. It looks like it might be Photoshopped. You see her fingers there, right? It looks like somebody might have altered it. But I found what looks like the same image, but she's holding a different sign. Here, I'm going to share that with you. What do you think, right? And so by doing this, we're expressing our skepticism. We're sharing something that legitimizes the skepticism, and hopefully invites them to look a little bit more closely at what we're sharing. Another way of doing this is through questioning, right? Hey, where did you get that? And sort of, validate that there's, and mention that there's a lot of misinformation out there, right? There's a lot of people who are trying to take advantage right now. There's a lot of false information. I'm just being extra cautious. Sometimes I don't even know what to trust, but so where did you get that? And by the way, I found something slightly different. So putting it back on them, hopefully what that does is it sort of inspires them to do some reflection about where it is. And they can sort of in that moment share the skepticism, because they're probably sharing something because maybe they have some skepticism, maybe they have some cynicism about something, or maybe they just shared something because they thought it was funny, right? We don't always know why. But by doing this cautiously and in a way that invites scrutiny, this is how you can get to hopefully, a conversation where the person realizes that they shared something that was false. And then you can also sort of, validate that, like, hey, yeah, I get it, right? When you saw that, like, I was angry when I saw it too, but it made me want to like look into it more. So again, it's about empathy, validating the emotion that's in there, and trying to recognize that it's easy for us to be manipulated. And hopefully when we do that, we can then also share how we found the information and hopefully lead to a better conversation about it. Okay, so that's sort of the nutshell of the main topics here. I'm going to pause again to see if there are some additional questions about any of the 4 key topics.
Hello again. Okay, so we have a question from Mary. I know static media is processed in the reasoning part of the brain. I know that time-based media is processed in the part of the brain most connected to emotion. Does this type of media have an impact on the response to mis or disinformation? Are we more likely to believe mis or disinformation depending on the delivery?
Yeah, I think we are. A lot of people are very visual, for one. But consider two things, right? Consider a manipulated image compared to a tweet with a video, right? It's very easy for us to sort of take in the information from an image or a meme than watching a video and maybe reading something that goes along with it, right? We might have that initial emotional response from the video, but as we're watching, right, the longer it takes us to sort of take in what we're looking at, the sort of less likely we are to be completely manipulated. But that being said, we could also, a video could also be constructed that draws us deeper in. So I think, yeah, the delivery does matter. An image is likely to sort of give us a very immediate emotional reaction. Videos, maybe even something that's text-based that we read, can take a little bit longer. The same can go for like a bumper sticker, right? You can be driving down the freeway, see a bumper sticker, and it makes you angry right away because it's something that's very short, very easy to take in. So yeah, the delivery does matter. And I think also in terms of where we get our information. So if someone shares something with us that's part of one of our social networks. So for example, I think that, something that comes from, someone that you tend to trust or respect will share something with you. Whereas someone that you maybe have a contentious relationship you're more likely to have a stronger emotional reaction because of that relationship. So it also does relate to your relationship with the source of information, as well as a delivery.
All right, we have one from Teresa. Where'd it go? How could we help some conspiracy theorists being considered, quote, rebellious heroes by some kids? That's your jam,
Yeah.
John. Conspiracies.
It is. So conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking are really problematic. We're actually in the middle of developing a new lesson on conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking that's going to be ready in a few months. So I think the important starting points, if we're going to talk about that, is that, if someone is looking at, if young people are looking at someone, they're, trying to hold them up as like, a folk hero. I think using questioning in that sort of scenario would be most effective, right? Using some Socratic questioning to get them to do some sort of almost metacognitive reflection that like, so why do you believe this person is a hero? What does it mean to be a hero? Who are some other people that you think are like that? What about this person who is, holding up information? So using questioning, I'm always a huge fan of questioning in general in my pedagogy, but really getting students to sort of justify what they believe first, and then start to talk about the cognitive dissonance of conspiratorial thinking. That there are, a lot of people who start to buy into conspiracy theories. There are sometimes some fears, some anxieties, some insecurities, and conspiracy theory is often a very easy path to alleviating that, making that discomfort go away. And the deeper you go into it, the more you are likely to engage in cognitive dissonant types of reasoning, like motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, and the like. So it's important in that to recognize that, in the end, conspiracy theories are also manipulating you. And in some ways, they're using even stronger emotions in your own emotions against you in kind of a different way. So it's very difficult sometimes to start that conversation, but I always encourage questioning when to approach that with young people.
Okay, we have a question from A. Fine. Can you speak about the use of language and word choice in misinformation?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think that is something that also ties to larger conversations about propaganda, about commentary and opinion writing and such, where people are trying to persuade you or mislead you. Is that word choice absolutely matters. I mean, if you think about it, things like that person is a terrorist or they are a freedom fighter, right? Do we call them undocumented immigrants? We call them illegal immigrants. Do we call them illegal aliens? The language in word choice absolutely matters. And the thing is that word choice is a really important part of that emotional response. There are some languages, some words and phrases that will trigger that emotional response, especially if it's a social or political cause that you have a strong connection to or a strong belief in. So breaking down language, and one way of really comparing that, if I can sort of point you in a direction, is to look at the difference between news articles and opinion pieces about the same topic. So for example, if we to study Black Lives Matter, right, when we look at news coverage of Black Lives Matter protests as opposed to opinion pieces, and we compare the language, we can see that the opinion pieces are meant to be persuasive, they're meant to be manipulative in some way, and they're going to use language differently. So that might be a good way to approach that as well.
We have a question from Rebecca. Could you address the issue of Facebook banning something they believe is wrong, but it's only an opinion? For example, there were a group of doctors that gave a news conference on COVID and Facebook removed it.
Yeah, I know exactly which news conference you're referring to. I don't remember. I don't remember the name of the group. That wasn't a news conference. That was actually a group of people spreading false information and conspiracy theories under the guise of a news conference. Because they had microphones in front of them. They called it a news conference. There were reporters out. There were some reporters out there covering it, but really, it was a staged event that the people who organized it were filming it. And if you look at the content of what they were sharing dangerous misinformation, blatant conspiracy theories, and they were doing it because their intent was not to inform. They were really trying to mislead us. And Facebook took it down because it, on a basic level, it was sharing dangerous information that's detrimental to the public health. I see your follow-up, Rebecca. How can we tell the difference? We can tell the difference by simply fact checking what people are, what they're telling us, right? We can listen to what they're saying, and we can Google and evaluate their claims. We can find fact checking resources where people have already done that. But another important step in this is to question the people who are speaking and the people who organized it, right? So when we see people in lab coats and they call themselves doctors, what are they doctors of? There was one woman was an actual medical doctor, but if you look at some of the things that she was claiming, she was spreading some very dangerous medical information that bordered on malpractice. And some of the people who share things under the title of doctor, sometimes in other sources, they may have a PhD in nutrition, they may have a PhD in holistic medicine, and they're trying to talk about the science of immunology, right? So we have to question, like, is this person actually an expert in this field? And then also, like, the organizers, it was organized by a hyper-partisan political group that has been known for sharing that. And so when Facebook bans things like this and removes it from the platform, we have to recognize that there are some topics that actually are very dangerous. Facebook just recently announced that they're going to start removing content that is promoting Holocaust denial. And one of the things about Holocaust denial, on one hand being horrific on its face, but a lot of Holocaust denial also comes along with very dangerous anti-Semitism and white supremacy, and it's sharing dangerous ideas, and it's causing people to share things that can then be used to promote and advocate for violence against other groups. And so I see the follow-up here. A Fine says, does the fact that they remove it, is it a violation of the First Amendment? No, it's not. The First Amendment protects us from the government censoring us. So if somehow the government compelled Facebook to delete content, that could be a violation of the First Amendment. There are some interesting First Amendment questions that are still being discussed relating to social media. So for example, one that comes to mind, there was a court case a couple years ago where people sued because President Trump had blocked them on Twitter and from his account. And people argued that the president blocking them was a violation of the First Amendment. That case was upheld and he was forced to unblock people. But there's a lot of different things that are happening. But the most important thing to remember, the First Amendment, is that it protects us from being censored by the government. Where can we find good information? I'm sorry, Miriam, I'm on a roll here.
You are.
Is there a news site I would recommend? Is there a fact-checking website I would recommend? Not one specifically, but I will tell you two things that I do recommend looking for. When it comes to a fact-checking organization, a fact-checking site, the reputable ones, the responsible ones are the ones that show their work. They not only tell us what the claim is, how they made their determination, they provide us with the evidence that they found and the context, and they share all of it in the fact check so that we can evaluate it for ourselves. And through whatever criticisms people may have about fact checkers, it's important to remember that that's what we have to look for, right? Reputable fact checkers show their work. When it comes to news sites and news organizations, I would refer back to the standards of quality journalism. You know, getting news is a very personal decision for a lot of us. So one of the things we have to recognize is that, are we looking for information because we want to be informed, or are we looking for information to support something that we already believe, right? And if we're trying to be informed, we have to find multiple sources. We have to be open to getting news and information from many different sources, and they have to follow those standards of quality journalism, right? They verify all the information that they publish. That information is verified from multiple quality sources. They provide all the necessary context for us to understand everything that's going on. They're transparent in their reporting. You know, they disclose relationships that the news organization, the journalist might have to the subject of the story. They're accountable for the mistakes that they make. And so we have to look for those things. So one of the things that I would like to recommend is to look into news aggregators. There are some great apps out there that actually will pull information from a variety of sources and will show it to you, and you can organize it often by topic or sort of, you know, you can do like, you know, US news, local news, finance and such. There's a lot of good ones out there. Full disclosure, they are supporting this webinar, but Smart News does have a great app that's a news aggregator. Apple News is another one that's also very good. Flipboard is another that does well for aggregating news. And another one is Google News. There's one that I saw recently. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but there was a news aggregator app that I saw, and the reason I found it was because I was searching for the Babylon Bee article with the LeBron James t-shirt. And what was interesting is that this news aggregator that I found actually was pulling articles from the Babylon Bee and reposting them as if they were news articles, and they were stripping away the context of the Babylon Bee. So you do have to be cautious with news aggregators because they should be upfront and transparent about what the source is that it comes from. So you have to be very careful.
All right, so I want to jump in and get back to a question that Tasha brought up earlier, because it is so good, and it's along the same lines of Maria's earlier. How do we walk the line between teaching kids to question the truth and have that healthy skepticism, right? Have some doubt without having them feel that there is no way of determining what is actually true.
Yeah, a lot of young people do naturally tend towards cynicism. I think what's important to remember is that we're not questioning the truth. We're questioning the information and the source of the information, right? What we're trying to get at is that we have to be able to have a set of standards for, the reliability of information, the reliability of the sources, the validity and reliability of the information that they're sharing. And so skepticism is really about what we feel confident that we can trust. So, I come back to questioning, right? You could have a discussion with your students. Okay, so what type of a source, like what would make you feel comfortable that you can trust information from it or from that person? Like, what is it? So what to you would be trustworthy or reliable? And then you can go from there and create some standards for how to evaluate those sources. All right, Miriam, I want to just go through some of the resources really quick, and then we can jump back into Q&A. I'm just going to share some important resources. Some of you may have seen some of these before. So this is a Google Drive folder where we have a lot of resources that I'm going to mention. A copy of this presentation will also be in this folder shortly after the conclusion. We have a wide variety of free resources from the News Literacy Project. Checkology Virtual Classroom, hopefully many of you are familiar with that. I mentioned the SIFT earlier, our weekly newsletter. We have our days of professional development called News Lit Camps, which are coming up. I'll share a couple of important dates with those. We have a new resource library on our website that has a lot of other resources. And you're going to be hopefully receiving some information very soon about our new News Literacy Educator Network. So if you haven't gone to Checkology, the link is here, get.checkology.org. It is completely free for you to use with your students. I mentioned First Draft, Dr. Claire Wardle's group at First Draft News. They have got a lot of great information specific to the misinformation ecosystem. They have some teaching resources as well. They have been doing a lot of amazing work in researching trends in misinformation. And I highly recommend using them, especially their debunking guides, if you want to get into teaching debunking misinformation. The Breaking News Consumer Handbook from onthemedia.org. This is one called their Fake News Edition. They have some of them are topic specific, and it gives you sort of a checklist to follow for how you can go through some of the important steps for verifying and debunking information. Looking for red flags, checking out the domain, and things like that. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to subscribe to the SIFT. The amazing work of my colleagues, Peter, Susanna, and Hannah. They put in an incredible amount of work putting this out every week. It was on vacation yesterday for Indigenous Peoples Day, but it will return on Monday. If you like to listen to podcasts, we have a new podcast. It's been out for a little over a month. It's called Is That a Fact? A new issue is coming out tomorrow. You can go to newslit.org/podcast or search for it on any of your favorite podcasting platforms. Also, we have an app called Informable. It's a brain training style app that gets into several different news literacy skills that you can practice with students. It is free to use and it is ad-free and available for Apple and Android. If you are in the Miami area, we have a very special News Lit Camp. It is a day of professional development with journalists from Univision. It's coming up on October 23rd. It is completely free. It is virtual, so it's coming up on the 23rd if you would like to join us. If you are not in the Miami area, we have our very first national News Lit Camp coming up on December 10th. We are partnering with the Texas Tribune. And again, it's a free full day of virtual professional development where we'll be talking about news literacy and journalism, and it is available to everyone. We're very excited for that. It's our first nationwide News Lit Camp, and that's coming up on December 10th. We have two other ones that we're going to be announcing soon in the next couple of weeks. If you are interested in seeing if we might be able to partner with your school district to bring a News Lit Camp specifically to your district and to a local news organization, there is a form here that you can fill out, and Miriam will be reaching out to try to see if that's something we can make happen. And then the last thing, and then we'll jump back into questions and answers. Your feedback is absolutely vital to us. It really helps us to make sure that we are providing quality professional development, making sure that you have ideas and resources and knowledge to be able to teach these really important topics. So this is a link to a very short survey. We would greatly appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to improve and to continue to bring quality professional development for you and your practice. So that is it for now. We're gonna stay on for a little while here for additional Q&A. So if you would like to take time to fill out the survey, we'll continue the conversation for however long we still have questions.
Great. Okay, so a few more questions. What is the challenge, the current challenge for journalists with the well of information out there? How do they stay current and fact-based to avoid the emotional current, especially with the speed at which information travels and changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So I'll take the second part of that, in that, you know, journalists and news organizations are always trying to follow those standards of quality journalism to sort of ensure that the practice, the process helps to keep the emotion out of it, right? We can't obviously keep emotion and bias out of the things that we do entirely. We're only human. But hopefully through the process and the steps and, you know, those standards, we can minimize that. And yeah, it is a challenge for journalists in a lot of important ways. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my colleagues, Susanna and Hannah, on the spot here. They are two of my amazing colleagues on the education team, but they are also both professional journalists. So I'm going to put that to them. So what is the challenge for journalists with just the overwhelming amount of information out there, Susanna and or Hannah?
Hi, this is Susanna. Thanks so much for the question. It is a good one. And, you know, I think that journalists today have their work cut out for them. You know, not only is it part of their jobs to sort through all information coming their way and to vet that information, but journalists today are, you know, currently dealing with a wave of misinformation on top of that. So journalists keep asking questions. They ask questions and they keep pushing sources to get direct answers to those questions. And I think also they work to confirm that information with other sources to check that information that they were given is accurate. Hannah, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, this is Hannah Covington. I would just kind of nod back to what John mentioned from the get-go, which is that we follow a very defined set of standards as journalists, and, you know, people trying to dupe or fool the media is nothing new, but the rate at which that's happening is unprecedented, I think. And so one of the challenges that we face as reporters is, first and foremost, making sure we make it really clear where information is coming from that we are including in stories. And so attribution is essential, but that is also central to quality journalism. So we follow the practices of our profession to the best of our ability, and just have to be really nimble and update stories as new information comes in.
Cool.
Since we're on the, yes, thank you both. And speaking of the journalism topic, we have a couple of questions related to media bias.
Okay.
And how we feel about, you know, the charts, like the media bias fact check, et cetera. We did cover that a little bit in webinar 1, but maybe you can touch on that briefly here.
So all sides and media bias fact check and those, I think they're an important starting point for a lot of discussions about media bias, but they shouldn't be the end point, because there's a couple of challenges that I think are happening here. So they've gotten better at this, but one of the challenges with some of these charts is that they don't differentiate between the news content and the opinion content of the organizations. That's one. The second is that they're comparing, in a lot of ways, standards-based news organizations with hyper-partisan blogs and organizations that are only putting out commentary and even putting out straight up conspiracy theory. So for example, you have charts they're putting, NPR on the same chart as InfoWars from Alex Jones. And, that they put out straight up conspiratorial content in a lot of ways. But also like hyper partisan blogs, like Wonkette, for example, like that blog isn't trying to be informative. They're really trying to put out, persuasive commentary. So those charts can be useful as a starting point to have a discussion. The other challenge is that it presumes that every piece of information put out by these organizations follows that same political leaning. And in some cases you might say that yes, at this news organization, the opinion pieces are predominantly conservative or predominantly liberal, but can we honestly say that it's every single piece? So the challenge is, yeah, they can be part of the conversation, but we have to use them as just one tool in a whole toolkit of trying to objectively evaluate information. Because if we just use that, it's a gross oversimplification of a very complex issue. And just a reminder, we'll be talking about bias in a lot more detail 2 weeks from now when Peter does his session on understanding bias.
Great. Okay, we have current challenges done. Where do you put political analysis programs that distort information, and how do you even categorize them?
So some political analysis programs are trying to, in some ways, walk a line between, informing about current events and then trying to present, multiple perspectives about a social or political issue. And in those ways, it is a form of commentary, a form of opinion. And what we have to be cautious of is recognizing that the people who are sharing their views on these programs, they're not necessarily trying to distort information. They're trying to present only the information that is favorable to what they believe or unfavorable to the opposing viewpoints. So yeah, there is some distortion, but in the end, it's also about persuasion and rhetoric. So if we want to have a good conversation about that, we do need to talk about, rhetorical devices, maybe even discussions of logical fallacies. How do we evaluate arguments? How do we look for evidence in support of an argument? We have a lesson in the Trichology virtual classroom that delves into this topic itself. But I think back to when I was a teacher, I was also a debate coach, and, teaching kids to debate was all about, presenting the most relevant, but also most favorable information that supports what you're arguing, or evidence that discredits your opponent. So part of what we also want to talk about at some point is that, in these discussions that we're having, we also want to try to recognize, is this a debate or is this discourse, right? Is this a program that's actually trying to share information, share viewpoints in a way that's about the discussion and the sharing of ideas? Or is this a show that's actually putting people on because they're going to try to shout each other down and they're going to try to be as sort of extreme as they can be because they're just really trying to win an argument? We want to prioritize those that encourage discourse over debate.
All right, well, all the open questions are answered. We are going to make the Q&As available and place them in the resource folder. Just ask you guys to hang in there so we can go through them all and add any text to them. But we'll get that in a few days. Anything that we want to add, rest of team?
Yeah, just a reminder that we have 2 more. We're going to go into digital verification and fact checking, in addition to sort of teaching how you can create some activities with your students. And then that deep dive into understanding bias. Both of those are going to be led by our colleague, Peter Adams. Again, Tuesdays, 5 o'clock Eastern. And so unless there are any additional questions, on behalf of the education team at the News Literacy Project, Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us. And please find ways to keep in touch with us so that we can keep the conversations going and we can continue to support you in integrating news literacy into your curriculum.
Thank you, everyone.